If you're building in healthcare AI right now, the most unglamorous problem in the entire stack is also one of the most expensive. Medical coding, as an example, every patient visit, every procedure, every diagnosis has to be translated into a string of billing codes before a health system gets paid. It's done by human coders, it's error prone, it's understaffed, and it costs the industry billions in denials and delays every year. Today's guest co-founded a company that Mass General Brigham built from scratch when everything else on the market wasn't good enough. CodaMetrix was spun out of Mass General Brigham in 2019, closed a 40 million Series B in 2024, and was just ranked #1 in the 2026 Best in Class for autonomous coding. The platform now supports over 500 hospitals across 27 states, powers coding for over 100,000 physicians, and delivers a 60% reduction in coding costs and a 70% reduction in claims denials on average. My guest today on CareShift is Kevin Schmitt, the co-founder and chief product officer of CodaMetrix, who built the product and engineering foundation of the company from day one out of one of the most respected health systems in the country.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I want to kind of start off the bat, kind of speaking a lot about how most healthcare AI companies kind of pitch health systems. And when you, from the outside, like they pitch it from the outside, and you built pretty much CodaMetrix, very interestingly, from the inside. It started from a Massachusetts Brigham hospital. Can you kind of talk about what it's like kind of being born, quote unquote, inside a hospital, and what advantages and potential maybe disadvantages you could have had from other companies from the outside?
Sure. No, without a doubt. So yeah, when we started CodaMetrix based on a consulting opportunity I had from, probably 20 years ago, where Mass General was looking to improve their medical coders' efficiency. So this is pre-AI. They were all working from still paper documents. The EHRs hadn't really caught on yet. It was a very different health IT environment back then. But they were quickly realizing that knowledge workers were hard to come by, and they were spending so much of their time not doing their job, but looking for the information to do their job. So this was also right around the time of the dot-com boom, and the web was becoming a practical tool. This was before kind of modern remote work. So they were literally having a hard time recruiting medical coders to come into Boston. So they wanted a web-based platform that could allow these coders to spend their time doing coding and not actually, pushing paper around and doing that. So when we started, it wasn't AI at all. It was all around how do we operationalize medical coding. So we spent a long time just kind of solving those early problems. And we were doing that as the EHRs were kind of becoming what they are today, these kind of massive centralized systems that are controlling kind of the patient the patient's cycle through the health system. But as we were doing that, we quickly started to realize that, as we're just enabling coders, that we got presented with an opportunity. Early 2000s, physicians doing charge capture was very popular, right? Places were losing revenue because doctors used to record that they saw a patient on a note card and they would hand it into their administrators, who would then batch them up and send them over for someone to do key punching. And it was just a terrible, terrible process. So when Palm Pilots came out and sort of early mobile devices, they all wanted to have doctors just record it directly into the computer. The problem with that, especially for surgeons, was the number of codes they had to use to represent their day was just massive. So one of the physicians at Mass General had started playing with, could he do some statistical analysis to figure out what are the codes he uses on a daily basis and have a more smart charge capture tool. And then we started working with him in building that in with our coding platform that we had been building to make coders more efficient, and realized that there's a real opportunity here. So we actually had to engage with some statisticians to help us really get the math right, to figure out how can we take kind of historical patterns with what you as a physician do and try to figure out how to make charge capture easier. And as we did that, we started to realize, like the average surgeon does, 80 to 100 different types of procedures a year. But out of those, 5 to 10 they do all the time. And out of those, there's only a couple of codes they do. So we pretty quickly were able to distill these charge capture forms that had hundreds or thousands of codes. And with a little bit of context, we could say, oh, you're probably going to use these 2 or these 3. And that was interesting and helpful. The problem with that was it required physicians to do charge entry, right? So you had your most expensive, highly rated individuals that were really responsible for patient care doing this administrative work. So it was terrible use of their time. It was just a terrible use. And as we were doing this, one of my co-founders, Jay Oslam, who actually teaches at Northeastern, his specialty wasn't statistics. So he was helping us with the math, but his specialty was machine learning. And he's like, instead of actually predicting what codes they might use, if we could use machine learning to read the note, we could learn what codes they actually use. So that was back in like 2014 we started doing that. So again, we're well ahead of the modern AI stuff at this point in time. Yeah, and it worked, right? So we were able to get we had this coding platform running for about 10 years at this point in time. So we had a massive amount of data we had already collected from knowledgeable Mass General coders. We had the medical notes. So that was one of the things our platform did early on. Was it collected the medical note in order to present to the coder. They used to have to request charts, right? The doctor would transcribe, into they call a phone number, they transcribe after the surgery, a transcriptionist would pick it up, dictate it, the doctor would then have to approve it, then that would make it into the chart, which the coder would then get a copy of to read the note and come up with the codes that would be put onto one of these charge entry tickets that someone would keep on. So we made that a completely electronic process. Our system identified when we knew a surgery was happening, we found the note, we would present it to the coder would actually do the codes, and then we'd ship it to billing. And then we added this machine learning process that said, great, we found the note. We had the machine read it first, come up with the codes that it learned from looking over all those years of history. Then we'd present it to the coder, and generally they would say, hey, that's right. They would approve it, and we'd move on. So that's kind of how we got started. There's no way we could have done that if we hadn't been inside of Mass General, right? Like the access to the information, the access to all the other systems, the knowledge we were able to work with from the coders and the clinicians, like that was a requirement to be inside, right? Just to get that intimacy, to be able to have all of those details and be able to get that system operationalized would have been really, really challenging to do from outside. So we couldn't have done this without them. And and again, we were there solving their operational problems. We weren't trying to invent a company at first, but as this got built, they certainly started to have desires like, boy, this could be useful for other people. Mass General is a pretty innovative place anyway. They have a lot of research. They have a lot of, clinical practices that actually roll into other startups. And that's how I actually met Hamid, who was the other co-founder here. He had done several other startups with Mass General. He had just gotten out of an imaging one, and he was looking to do one more. And he went back to Mass General and said, hey, do you have anything else I could work with you guys on? They introduced me to Hamid, and then, he started getting into this. And again, we were at the right point in time. We were just ahead of the AI boom. We were using machine learning, and we had an ROI, right? So because we were saving coders this incredible amount of time. So we actually weren't removing coders from the equation, which was interesting. Like there was early concerns that AI was going to kind of kill a lot of jobs, and it still has the possibility to do that. But that we were trying to add efficiency at first. Right? We're trying to get it so that these are commodities, the coders, right? They're hard to find, especially good ones who really know what they're doing. And we were just trying to make them more efficient.
It's very interesting because when I was doing my research, one of the biggest things I saw is you guys kind of focus a lot on the autonomous coding aspect. And it's very interesting. It rang the bell. It's not assisted coding aspect. I guess it's more kind of a bigger claim that you guys are kind of going with. Why did you guys decide to go fully autonomous from day one instead of kind of building incremental trust over time and kind of potentially doing that and then saying, hey, let's go fully autonomous now?
Well, part of it was we almost backed into it, to be honest with you. And it's because of that coding platform we built. We had done so much work that to enable coders to be more efficient, that there was a lot of autonomous activity already happening in the system before we added the full AI pieces into it. So we were already doing the work to identify that a provider had an interaction with a patient that we needed to capture charges for. So that was already happening autonomously. We were already identifying the medical notes that we needed to pull together in order to present to our coder. And again, initially it was human coders, but it became AI coders. And then And then once the human finished their job, we were autonomously getting those charges to where they needed to go. So there was a lot of autonomous already happening as we were adding efficiencies to the process. So we didn't just start there. We grew into it over time. But as we did that, we developed this whole platform for how to manage that and do it safely at scale inside of the health system. So there were a lot of checks and balances that we had to put in place just to hold ourselves honest that we weren't missing something or we weren't losing something. So there was a lot of plumbing that went in to make that just work when we weren't attempting to be autonomous. So that final step from going from having all of those pieces in place to adding the AI piece, it wasn't a leap. It was an incremental step for them. But this is another place that it was huge for us to be inside of Mass General when we started, because we had a proof point. We could actually show this system working in a real modern health system. And it's obviously Mass General is one of the best health systems around the country. They're large enough that it wasn't like we did this in a small doctor's office where people might say, yeah, you did that here, but you're not going to be able to replicate it, right? They were a large enough, in a sophisticated enough place that, that the fact that we got it to work there had meaning. And that was really helpful when we were talking with the early adopters, because we could show that this actually worked. And they could talk from their experience running the platform that, the autonomous aspects in the reporting and the back end that we put in to manage all of that, were good checks and balances to make sure that the systems were doing what people thought they should be. But again, so that ended up being a huge advantage to us to be able to start inside and get it operationalized and be able to work all the details out while people were still involved, so that as you reduce the scope of what the people have and have them be less operators and more, quality checks on the back end, that was an easy transition to make. Because again, we never, even when we're autonomous now, we don't remove people from it. We just have them operate in different ways. So the system will still do a lot of processing, but there's a lot of checking going on to make sure the system is running on the rails. And that's where we've changed what a lot of their coders do. They don't do as much abstraction where they have to read the note and then actually come up with the codes. They're now checking, did the machine come up with the right notes? And we've actually had to do a lot of work with that, because that's a whole nother problem to get into. So.
Since you guys started, you guys were very early, as you mentioned, to the AI wave. You guys started as pretty much an AI-based company over time. If you were to start CodaMetrix today outside of a health system, do you think it would have been harder? Which it probably would have been harder. But what would be the steps that you would have taken to kind of potentially show ROI to these health systems and bring connection to the coders and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, you really need to understand, to show ROI, you need to understand enough about how the business works. So it's assuming you've got the experience to understand where are those businesses spending money, right? What are their cost drivers, right? Because if you don't understand that, you're not going to be able to show ROI. But you need to be able to tell that story to a CFO, right? That's who we mainly sell to, right? We have to get approved by the clinical people, and the coders certainly need to sign off on us. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to make that financial case, because we're in rev cycle, right? So it's the CFO who ends up having to pay for all of their operations to get these medical bills put together. So it became fairly straightforward once you understand where those cost drivers are, how to be able to paint that ROI picture. But again, we needed to have a fair amount of operational knowledge to know what are the cost drivers that, the CFO cares about, and how do we tell that story. And this is one of the things that I was more on the system side, but Hamid, who again was one of my co-founders here, he had done enough startups that he knew how to tell that story, right? He knew we had to pull a lot of details together, but it was being able to really be able to explain to the CFOs, you're spending your money here, here, and here, and this is where we attack those points. We're able to put these checks and balances in on the autonomous side to make sure that, we actually are, capturing all the revenue, for instance. Like that used to be a big problem before we were involved. Like people would miss stuff, right? It was easy. The EHRs are continuing getting better for closing these revenue gaps where a care was provided and charges weren't captured. But that's a relatively new thing for the EHRs to do that somewhat more natively. And there's still a whole bunch of workflows where they don't do it well. But again, it's those types of things where we understood where people were spending their time. So that's where we were really able to target the system features that we're able to say, hey, people are putting a lot of time in here. This is a really expensive area. We need to be able to address that directly to be able to make that ROI statement to those CFOs.
How did you guys get the partnerships that you guys have
Mhm.
now past MGB? Because obviously you couldn't do all of what you did at MGB at other health systems. So how did you figure out, the ROIs and all of the exact
Right.
time points of this is where the ROI will be for you guys at other clinics? What was that process like?
Yeah, so luckily, a couple things came into there. So Mass General has its own innovation office, right? So they have venture groups inside of Mass General that have two main purposes. One is to bring new technology into the health system, and the other is to take technology that was born in the health system out. So we worked with that group quite extensively to be able to help shape this. But luckily for us, a lot of the cost drivers are relatively consistent in the rev cycle, right? Like human coders are a big portion of this. Being able to understand the integration concerns, how the data moves there are these macro patterns that hold out. So a lot of the key ROI drivers are fairly straightforward from health system to health system. The mechanics are very different, but those main kind of tenets when it comes into ROI itself tend to hold fairly stable. And so it really just starts to turn into, one, we work through that knowledge of Mass General and had the ROI a pitch. We worked with their venture groups when we started approaching other health systems. And then
Right.
it was just a lot of hard work and a lot of refining it, right? Like as we would go talk to groups, it's testing that pitch, figuring out, what are the issues that speak to each system? Because that was one of the things I don't think we appreciated inside of Mass General is there are a lot of different drivers at the end of the day. We kind of had the basics, right? But that isn't
Absolutely.
enough to necessarily get someone to sign a deal with you, right? You really need to understand what is driving their organization. Some of the places we work with have unionized coders, so that completely changes the dynamic in the way you have to talk to those organizations. Others were relying far more heavily on their clinicians to do the medical coding job than they were on coding staff. So again, in those, you didn't have this big group of medical coders. So now you had to think about where does the fact that they're not using coders to come up with the codes, does that cause troubles in the rev cycle? And it turns out it causes troubles later on in the rev cycle. It causes denial problems. It causes underpayments, right? Or it causes missing charges. We had to start to evolve our sales pitch as we got that feedback that, our initial ROI play was largely, we're going to reduce coding effort, right? We're going to allow your coders to be more productive, to essentially manage more cases, to get more charges into your billing system. And for shops that had employed coders, that sold really well. But for places that had unionized coders, that was a problem. And again, the ones that had physicians doing more of their work, like that ROI story didn't quite play. So we had to get more robust over time. And a lot of that was just learning and listening to the customers, right? Like that's a big part is being able to when you go to sell, right, you're trying to tell your story, but you really need to listen to their problems, right? And try to make sure you can position how are you going to solve their problems? Because that's what this turns into, right? Like, and if you can solve their problem, they're willing to listen to you.
You guys started all the way in 14, you mentioned, yeah, and now 2005.
Well,
Wow.
the platform started in 2005, so the yeah,
2014.
then the AI started in 2014, and
Right.
CodaMetrix commercially was finally spun out in 2019. So it took a while. The system had been around for a while before we got to the point where we actually got outside of Mass General. So, and to be honest, you early on you mentioned you wanted to know one of the problems with coming out of the healthcare. It was that time, right? Like we Hamid and I met in 2016. So we had our earlier, AI models going in, and we were really starting to do the whole autonomous thing inside of Mass General. So it took us 3 years from the time he got brought in as the CEO entrepreneur to bring it out to actually get it outside of the organization. So it's a big organization. It's really conservative. So they're not fast. Right. Their speed was not their concern. So being able to actually get the organization to a point where we could go to those external representatives and be able to talk to other health systems, that took a long time. That was not a quick process. And at the end, I would certainly take being inside to start, and that was the tax we had to pay, the some of the speed towards the end.
Absolutely. And I think that complexity of how hard it is, it's still there today. Like you tell like a tech startup or tech someone that you're working in medical coding, they're probably they either don't know what that is, or if they're in healthcare, they're thinking, okay, you're in the intersection of clinical documentation, regulatory compliance, potentially revenue, mostly revenue, obviously, and and then they're like, how in the world are you fixing that? And it's so complicated. Can you like walk through like why the potential complexity and why potentially not that many companies or people doing it is actually a moat, and why it could potentially not be?
So the complexity stems back from the way the health systems used to be managed. This is in the pre-AHR days. It was a very common practice 20 years ago to have these best of breed systems. So everybody had a different mix of systems. So you'd have a different technical or facility billing system. You'd have a different professional billing system. You'd have a different ADT system. So you had this, smorgasbord of information systems put together, which caused all of these places to build their operations differently. So there are some general macro patterns that hold true, right? The way we integrate with radiology systems is largely the same. The way we integrate with pathology systems is largely the same, but the radiology systems and the pathology systems are not the same. The surgery systems are not the same. So there are all these little pockets that have built up that while the macro pattern is true, the micro patterns are not at all. So that complexity just built up over time. And as the EHRs started to come around, Epic specifically, a lot of their selling features early on were the ability to make Epic be what you need it to be for your health system. So, the people say, if you've seen one Epic system, you've seen one Epic system. And it's true. They're all very different. They're the same fundamental Epic platform, but the way they get used and the way that the clinical and financial operations run are all very different. And that is a huge challenge. And it's still a challenge for us today. This is probably the biggest issue we have as a company in scaling, is that the time it takes us to implement our solution is long, and it's trying to work through all of that complexity is hard. Early on, and I guess this was another detriment to being inside of Mass General, we made some assumptions. We knew the environment was complex, don't get me wrong. So we knew we were going to have to do a lot of work on integration when we went to new health systems. And so our platform was built early on to handle all that. We just didn't appreciate how much subtlety there was between, one given health system and how they document a case and how they bill it to the next. Like there was just a lot of nuance that our system didn't appreciate at first. And so early on versions of it, every time we went to install, we were adding functionality. We just had to keep adding and adding, just because it's not that our system was doing anything wrong. It just didn't work for the next institution, because they made a choice when they hooked up their radiology information system to their billing system to do this process this way. And because we were trying to automate it, we needed to work with that. We couldn't tell them to go re-implement their clinical systems to meet with us, right? So we had to mold ourselves around how they worked. And again, the more we get into it, the easier the patterns are to see. And there probably are 3 or 4 primary different ways people implement radiology information systems when it comes to how they do their charge capture. And we had to build all of that complexity to deal with it. But that's where we've been building this since 2005,
Yeah.
right? And we continue to run into these challenges. So that's a lot of software. This isn't something you're going to just have Claude go whip up for you overnight and throw into a code set tomorrow to deal with, because there's just a lot of nuance that and you need to be able to understand kind of where the rev cycle folks are coming from, where the clinical folks are coming from, and how does that turn into what we have to do, right? Like, we need to understand their problem in order for us to be able to provide that solution back to them.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. You mentioned the workflow is still so long to implement into these systems. Is it? I mean, I'm assuming it's a
Yeah.
little bit shorter compared to what it was before.
Continues. We continue to shorten it, but yeah, if you go look at our investors, they want us to keep bringing it smaller and smaller. We need to convert our contracts into real revenue here. Keep it moving. And this is where ideally we would love to have a standard cookie cutter platform that our customers met our needs so we could just roll it out. But that's just not the reality we face. We need to meet our customers where they are. So that's where our platform has to keep getting more sophisticated in order to meet them where they are. Because if they need to change how they operate, especially if they have to change how any of their clinical systems work, that becomes a big deal. They can't, we can't do a rev cycle project that makes them change their clinical systems. We'll never get it live. We'll never get it live. So it's as much of just, again, we have to meet them where they are in order to get it live. But that's where we need to make it easy for them, because if they have to do a lot of internal change management, the wheels come grinding to a halt. If we can take their integration points as they exist and make them work, then we can move quickly. If we make them build us new integration points or change their workflow, that's where the process extends out dramatically. And so it's threading that needle, right? Like, I don't want to build any more software than I need to continue to deliver on these contracts. But if I don't build the software, I can never get it live.
Right. And you guys are kind of working with multiple different teams here to make sure you can kind of get the tool into different multiple systems. So and I guess that makes me very curious. Like, right when the CFO says like, okay, we're good, let's use CodaMetrix, Kevin, we're all in. What is the first couple steps that you guys take on your side of things to start implementation?
Assuming we've already got a contract and have gotten through the security reviews, that will take however long that takes. The biggest thing for us is getting the integration points, right? Understanding what integrations they already have in existence that we can rely on and reuse versus what do they need to build. Because a lot of their integration teams are backed up. They've got a 12-month or an 18-month project list already when we show up. So great, CFO signed off. That's wonderful. Then the CIO says, which of your other projects do you want me to push down on the list to get these guys in? So again, that's where, as easy as we can make it on those integration teams to reuse whatever they already have, is going to be able to enable us to get the data flowing, because we're all about the information flow, right? We need to receive information from the clinical systems to know that, Dr. Joe just saw the patient, to know that, okay, we have a charge capture opportunity. We have an interaction that we need to care about. Then we need to collect all the relevant clinical information that the coders need, whether it's a human coder or an AI coder, to be able to code that. So we need to know that documentation's available. It's complete. It's passed all the quality checks. It's good to go. And then we need to be able to do our job, come up with the codes, and then we need to get it back into their billing process. So as much that we can do to reuse whatever tech they already have, that shortens it. But again, the problem with that is that involves us writing a bunch of software. It's hard for us to say, this is our standard, meet it. A lot of them will do it, but that's where you get put back in these queues because they can't use the integration point they've already built. We now need to get those integration resources to write us a new HL7 interface, or the fire endpoint isn't stood up right for what we need because they limited the scope of it for these other projects. So we only get half the documents we need out of the fire endpoint, not all of them. So they're now having to make changes that causes them to go regression test their other workflows that were using those integrations.
And you mentioned a critical point there, and I think that kind of goes into, ever since you guys started, I guess you guys were integrated into the Epic workflows to get that into the provider's kind of system. And that's something that still today there's a lot of debate. Are you making sure you're actually in the provider's workflow to make sure that they can use it without using a secondary dashboard or whatever? So in that case, how did you guys make that decision at first? Is that something that they were asking for, or you guys decided, let's just make it maybe as easy as possible to go into the EHR?
Well, again, we were trying to be autonomous, and the way the workflows were built before CodaMetrix, the information flow that I just described, right? The patient has an interaction with the patient. The clinical service needs to get done. The documentation needs to get collected to describe what happened. And someone needs to come up with the codes that need to get sent to the billing system. That has to happen, whether it's people doing it or whether it's AI doing it. All these health systems have different ways that happens. People do different jobs in different places at the different health systems. So like a key thing for us is trying to figure out, if you're billing for radiology, I'll give a really specific example. A given charge code for radiology, there's two components to it. There's one that goes for the doctor's bill, and there's one that goes for the hospital, the facility bill. In order to tell the payers which side you're billing for, you have to add these modifiers. It's a modifier 26 to say it's for the doctor, and a modifier TC to say it's for the hospital. Some places, those modifiers get added by the radiology information system. So they tell you which component is. Some places those are added by the coder. So the coder needs to put those on. Some places they're added in the billing system. So when we go to deploy, we need to understand, well, how are they set up to do this? And is it something that they're going to be sending this so we don't have to figure it out? Or is it something that we don't have to figure it out because they're going to do it downstream? Or do we actually have to figure it out because their people did it? And if we're going to do what their people did autonomously, we need to take that job on. So this is a job at some places we have to do, and at other places we don't. And at some places we have to know what the right answer is, and at other places we don't care. So it's like, and that's just one of 100 of those types of things, right? And it's so like that's where the complexity just gets out of control. But every place has made a slightly different choice for how those types of decisions happen and where they happen in their health system. And that's where we just need to figure out, okay, what's the next one doing? Where did they make these choices? And therefore, what do we have to do to make it easy for us to automate? Because we get paid when we automate something, right? That's where we get our money, right? When their people don't have to go do all that work, that's what makes us money. So we can either make them change to how we want to work, or we can adapt to them. And we're trying to meet in the middle, right? We're trying to bring best practices that we've learned from working. We're in over 30 health systems and a lot of big name health systems. So we're starting to build a nice set of best practices for, what is the good way that radiology charging works here, right? Like, how do we get the information from, if you're in the Epic world, out of Radiant, right, into the router, and then finally into Resolute to do the billing? So, and Epic has a bunch of guidance on this, but again, everybody starts to implement it differently.
It is definitely. And I wanted to kind of go into a big headline that you guys saw, and that when I was doing my research, is a 70% reduction in claim denials. I think that's really important, because denials obviously aren't just a sign of revenue, but there's something upstream in the clinical documentation or something in the medical coding that's broken. What does your platform catch when it comes to the coding that human coders kind of miss overall?
So there's a couple things. I think the biggest thing we get out of AI with this is consistency, right? We're able to, at the end of the day, while a lot of the newer AI is not deterministic, right? Like, it's probabilistic in how it actually comes up with what it's going to do. We've spent a lot of time trying to make this as deterministic as we can. We need to be able to rationalize, why did we come up with these codes? And are these the right codes for this particular clinical encounter? And as we built the systems to do that, one thing systems are good at is they're consistent. And so as we start to evaluate clinical documentations and come up with the code sets, we're able to consistently come up with an answer. And at first, it doesn't matter if the answer is right or wrong. It's the fact that it's consistent, because if it's wrong and it's consistent, we can fix it, right? We can figure out, okay, what's causing us to get to the wrong answer, and we can systemically fix it. So that predictability and the ability to be able to kind of look at this in a large set and come up with a consistent response to the same type of input is a huge thing. And that is one of the areas that people actually struggle with. And this is one of our bigger challenges. And at some point we'll have to get into the whole coding quality side of this, but people have, I don't want to ding people here. It's not people's fault. The task people are asked to do is incredibly complicated. The code sets that people have to navigate, there's tens of thousands of different choices they have to pick from. They're built by committees of people. A lot of them are ambiguous in nature, and they have to apply those to a set of notes that were written by different humans, right? The physicians are writing these notes, and the physician doesn't document necessarily everything that's in their head. So there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of interpretation that happens here, and it's really hard for a person to have a consistent response to the same input. We do a lot of testing, both of our own AI coder and human coders, and this inner observer reliability is a big problem. It's not even just if me and you both look at the same set of code cases, assuming we're both expert coders, we're going to agree 70% of the time. But even if I look at a case in the morning and you give me that same one in the afternoon, I'm only going to agree with myself 80 to 85% of the time. And again, it's not that the people aren't educated. It's not that they're bad at what they do. They're so heavily influenced on kind of what's in their head at the time. They're trying to make a lot of guesses as to what was the doctor's intent when they wrote this note, right? Of these 3 different codes that are somewhat ambiguous, which is the best one that describes this? So there's a lot of nuance that comes into this in order to do it. And that's where us having this be in a system, we've been able to do a lot of work to help be consistent here. And so that's one of the big drivers. And again, we should talk more about quality here in a little bit. But the other thing we're able to do is because we're a system, we're able to check all the rules before we come up with our answer, right? We're able to go see, okay,
Absolutely.
which payer is this and which policies are we going to run up against, right? And we're able to go look for the problems that, this payer only allows one of these a day, right? You've now done the second one. This is going to get denied. So we're able to tell them before it gets denied so they can start to take, the corrective actions to fix it before we've already sent it off to the payer. They've brought it back. It's now a rejection crew. So we're able to be much more proactive with problems because we're able to look and check for all those things. And that, again, that's hard for people to do, to be able to understand. Like our health systems have hundreds of different payers they work with every day, and they all have slightly different rules. And there's no way a person can keep track of all those different payer policies across all those different code sets. It's not feasible. So, but modern systems, that's one thing computers are great at. They're great at recalling information, right? So we can know, oh, this is for Blue Shield of Minnesota, or this is for, Aetna, whatever. And we can go check those policies and do a lot of that work, make sure we're coding according to the policy before we actually send it off to the payer. So it's a couple different things that really allow us to do denials. But really the biggest thing is that consistency. We're able to take that set of codes from that note and come up with a consistent answer that we're able to test against the policies to figure out, did we code this right? And how do we need to change our coding to be able to be, both correct, right? We have to be correct. We need to be able to survive an audit if someone goes back and looks at it. But we also need to be able to operate within the policies.
Coding quality is very interesting because I think comes a lot into surgery coding, which is, I would say, notoriously more complex than regular outpatient kind of, regular information of code generation. And obviously surgery can, and if you have like unprocessed or wrong codes that are wrong, it can cause so much of missed revenue, tens and thousands of dollars, right? How does your model actually kind of handle, I guess, that level of specificity, and where does it either still need a human review, and where have these health systems actually been able to trust the AI when it comes to making sure it's as good as possible?
So early on, when we started back in the machine learning days, one thing that became very clear was there's these consistent patterns that set up within the health systems, that there are a lot of procedures they do that are they're bread and butter. They do a lot of them. They're very consistent. Screening mammograms or colonoscopies, right? A lot of these places do a lot of that work, right? So the codes are generally the same. Most of the time when you go in for a screening mammogram or a colonoscopy, they don't find anything, right? And therefore the coding for those becomes fairly consistent. So for some of the obvious things, it's actually fairly mechanical. You don't even need AI to solve a lot of those problems, to be honest with you. But where you do start to need the AI is to start picking up on the exceptions, right? So, 80% of them look like this, but you need to now identify, okay, we're in the 20% that don't look like that, right? So now what do we do? And this is where how we've done this has changed a lot of the times. Again, early on, we were just hardcore machine learning. We were looking for kind of patterns in the note, in the patterns of the words and how they would correlate with the code sets that we get generated. And we still do a lot of that because that still holds true. But the problem with the straight machine learning approach here was that it wasn't able to take a lot of the context into play. And this is where the new modern AI systems, especially the large language models, are much better. They understand language much better. And so they're able to bring a lot more context to play. And so that helps a lot. But to be honest, the big thing we had to do here, we had to figure out, how do we judge quality, right? How do we judge that we have the right set of codes? And that has been largely subjective. An expert would look at what somebody did and they would decide, yeah, you did this right. But as I said earlier, there's this inner observer reliability problem where 2 experts will look at the same things and come up with different answers a substantial portion of the time. And even the same expert, if you give them the same back, there's no guarantee you're going to get the same answer. So we ended up developing and have a whole bunch of patented IP around this coding quality rubric of how do we judge quality and not have it be subjective, but have it be much more qualitative, right? We need a an actual score sheet to go through and say, based on the intent of this exam and the services that were provided and the problem the patient has, what is the correct way to code this? Because there's codes for all kinds of things that might not be relevant for rev cycle. There's all kinds of codes that, might be clinically interesting that aren't, relevant. Or there's payer rules that cause you to say, well, with this payer, I don't use this code. I use this other code. So trying to figure out, like, did we come up with the right code? Like, if you're not going against the right payer rules, you're not going to have the right code. So we spent a lot of time on trying to figure out, how do we judge whether the code set is right? And that started selfishly because we were trying to figure out whether our AI was doing the right thing. But as we got into it more, that's where we started to realize that this is a really hard job for people, and the consistency for a human isn't what, a lot of people think it is. A lot of places talk about how they code at 95% accuracy. And when you really start to test against a real rubric here, like that doesn't hold true. Now, there's a lot of nuance in that. So I'm not trying to badmouth people, because it's not a person problem. It's a really complicated task. And there just haven't been the systems to manage it in a way that allows you to have the repeatability and build the trust that you're doing the right thing. So we've invested a lot into those sorts of processes. We actually just spun up a new coding quality council with a bunch of our partner customers to be able to start to work across the industry, to start to be able to bring some light to this, because until we can all agree that, this is the standard, right? When I see this note, these are the right codes, and everyone can consistently say those are the right codes for this, billing operation.
Right. And I think that's a really, really good point that you brought up. And one thing I really wanted to interestingly explore, and this might be an investor type question, is that Epic is kind of coming into the coding tools and now expanding deeper into revenue cycle as we go, and as we don't do any acquisitions. And you guys are very integrated into these platforms. How do you kind of think about your relationship with Epic, the health systems, and where can you guys stay complementary?
No, we already see that. When we first started with CodaMetrix, Epic wasn't doing any of their AI, right? Again, we started before AI was a thing here. So early on, we weren't getting direct, competition from Epic, but now they are. They've got their own AI models. The big differentiator for us is we're able to do the autonomous portion of it, right? We're able to take the clinical information and autonomously move it all the way through. Epic still isn't doing the autonomous coding, really, right? So, but there's a chance they're going to get there. So this is where, we need to stay competitive, right? We need to be able to, stay out in front of them. Epic is a huge company, right? And so they have lots of resources, but it takes them longer to move than it does for anyone else. So this is where, we do need to stay close to the problem space and be able to make sure that we're delivering the highest quality we can. And we have been working in this for a long time, and we do know a lot of work. And again, like this whole coding quality thing, this is going to be a problem for any sort of AI vendor to come out here who wants to do this autonomously, because this whole thing where if I look at codes in the morning and I say the answer is A, and then I look at the same thing in the afternoon and say it's B, if they're judging what the autonomous coding does, if you catch them when you agree, then great, they're happy with you. But if you catch them on the other side of it, they're going to start seeing, and again, it's not that the people are doing anything conscious here, right? It's a hard problem, and they haven't had the right tools to really judge this. And so that's where we, in that space, we do have our own intellectual property, and we do have some patents out there. So hopefully we can have a little bit of defense as we continue to work on this quality space to be able to help, build that moat around ourselves to help protect our intellectual property here.
One thing that you mentioned was the amount of sign-offs that you need to get from health systems, and these sign-offs, from IT, from compliance, from cycle leadership, whoever. And this is kind of interesting. I wanted to know is like, what stakeholder has been the hardest to convince so far, and what does it take for them to kind of say, okay, we trust you guys?
So it's interesting. So probably the easiest one to convince has been the CFO. Right? Because again, we can show a direct ROI because we figured that out. Probably the hardest one to convince are the coding managers, right? They're worried that one, we're directly going into their space, right? This is their backyard at this point in time. And a lot of them, while they're under pressure to deliver, they don't have the staff, right? They're worried we're going to take their jobs. So there's a lot of concern there, and I don't blame them, right? But this is where we need to partner with them, because we can't do this without qualified coders to be able to look at our stuff and say, yes, we're doing it wrong or doing it right. and we don't do everything well. We didn't get into, how do we know when we can automate or how we not, but that's a big part of what we do is when is it safe for us to make an autonomous decision here versus when do we need to back off and get a person involved? And we put in a lot on that part of the system, understanding where the system is consistently coming up with the right answers that the customer is comfortable with. And then how does that change over time? Because the whole environment is constantly changing. Obviously, the AI changes, the code sets change, the upstream systems change. So how do we manage that and partner with our customers to do it? And what we're finding with the customers that have been with us over a while is we're changing the jobs of their coders. They're not as worried about the production and getting the cases done. They're more worried about the quality. And so it's changing that job a little bit. And that's where we need to work with those managers more to understand, that this is how AI is being used. We're not just going after jobs. I'm sure some jobs will be lost. Don't get me wrong, but other jobs get created as that happened, right? Because in order to support the tool, we need to do other things. And that other stuff is all this quality stuff. And that's where it starts to become quite the flywheel, because as we're making that ROI and helping to remove some of the operational burden just to get the bills paid, we're also increasing the quality of the information. And so that quality feeds back and is be able to use by the rest of the organization to do all kinds of interesting work. So it ends up being this interesting flywheel, but you need to get it going. And until you get it going, you're just in there bailing, trying to get the bills paid, right? And so as they work with us, that dynamic starts to change and it becomes different. But you have to build trust that you're not going to blow their operations up, and you're not going to all of a sudden displace everybody, right? But it's hard. It's a hard thing to do. So, and to be honest, it's no different than what we're facing. Like, Claude and, ChatGPT and, there's all kinds of new programming AI stuff. And I have software engineers. Are they going to still have jobs? Well, yeah, they are, right? Now, do I need quite as many of them? Maybe not, because, they don't have to spend as much time authoring the code, right, to build our system, right, but they need to supervise it. And that's no different than what we're doing, right? The coders aren't spending as much time actually coming up with the codes, but they still need to be supervising that the system is doing the right things.
ChatGPT came into the RCM space a little bit, just kind of working in that, and obviously Anthropic did. But I've heard it's not the best. It's not really clearly kind of giving massive ROIs to the health system. I don't know. Maybe you're hearing something wrong.
We're hearing the same, but it's a lot of the problems I've already brought up, right? Like there's not the healthcare space isn't as consistent as one would like. So when you bring automation to it, right, if your tool does something very specific, you need to find the specific customers that operate that way to take advantage of your tool. If they don't operate the way your tool does and your tool can't adapt, then you're stuck, right? You're not going to give them the benefit they thought, because they now need to put people around it in other places to deal with its shortcomings, right? So it's a sophistication problem, but it's also a standardization problem. As we continue to add more of these systems and processes become more standard, it actually becomes easier to automate things. But until we get to that point, we're early on in those phases. And this is where automation is hard at the moment. And until we get to the point where there's more standardization, it's going to be a struggle to see the ROI. And that's where you need to make sure when you're whether it's you're buying your next, Claude license because you want to use Claude code, or you're buying CodaMetrix to do your medical coding, right? Like, is that AI actually supporting what you need, right? And does it work in a way that's complementary to your workflow, or do you have to change? And are you willing to change to work with the tool, right? And that's a hard question for business owners to grapple with.
Where in revenue cycle do you think full automation genuinely is ready to get today? And where do you think humans still have to play a massive role?
So obviously in the medical coding side, it is ready. We're proving it every day that we're able to really automate these workflows. It's hard, don't get me wrong, but we're really able to deliver on that. The areas that we're not really ready for yet is anything that gets more clinical, right? So pre-auth is one that I'm really interested in, and there's so much effort that goes into the pre-auth space, but you need so much context in order to be able to understand the pre-auth problem. And that's where it's getting the context into the AI in order for it to help is really hard. So that's an area that I'm really opportunistic, and I'm thinking, boy, there's a lot that could be done there. But a lot of the automation that's happening in pre-auth is automating the manual steps. It's not really doing the whole process. It's not really understanding that this patient needs an expensive procedure that we have to do pre-auth for. I need to make sure I've done the appropriate clinical protocols that justify it so that I can get my pre-authorization. It's a lot of the automation is it's automating the phone call to the insurance company to check the status, right? So people put a lot of time into that. I don't want to ding those sorts of automation, but you're not really automating pre-auth at that point in time, right? You're helping to add some efficiency. So they're at their baby steps. They're not really doing pre-authorization on the whole. So that's one that it's a hard nut to crack just because of all the context you need, but there's a huge opportunity there for these systems.
Absolutely. I mean, if you could kind of automate one more thing in revenue cycle, what would that be that you haven't really built yet?
So the biggest thing that impacts us that is CDI, clinical documentation improvement, the quality of the note itself. Again, early when we were talking about denials, I mentioned how we do a lot of checking to make sure that, this is ready to go. As we're doing that, we're starting to have all these really interesting observations that, boy, the doctor didn't put in the right attestation statement here. We can't do conscious sedation on this one, right? Or they're working with a resident. This needs to get signed differently. There's a lot of very mechanical things that are even outside of the clinical quality. But then when you get into the clinical stuff, does that documentation actually have the context that we need to make the right decisions, right? Do we actually have all the information that we need and be able to pump that back? And there's a lot there that impacts our ability to come up with the right code that we're starting to recognize that, boy, I'd love to work with those physicians to get that feedback so we can make it easier for the docs to get the right information into the note easier. And again, there's a lot of work on the AI space to help get notes better. And this will be something that there's going to be a lot of change over the next couple of years to try and help make it easier for the doctor to get that high quality note that has all the right information, whether they're using some AI generated, note taker to help, generate the note, or they're using a system like ours on the back end that's saying, hey, you forgot to put your attestation statement in here. Fix it now, because otherwise what's going to happen is your claim's going to get held up and there's going to be a query that comes back to you in a couple of days and you're going to have to remember what you did 3 days ago, right? Let's fix this now as opposed to in a couple of days, because you're going to want to get paid for whatever you just did here, right?
You guys work with, I think, 9 of the top 20 U.S. News honor roll health systems. I saw that. It's a lot.
Yeah, I don't know where the exact count is, but it's a lot of them. So I mean, this is where Mass General helped us, right? We were in one of them to start off with, right? So just being able to go to their peers to say, well, it's working at Mass General, we stand a chance to work for you too. Like, that's huge, right? That automatically lowers some of the concerns that, this isn't going to work for me. But a lot of those organizations, they have similar backgrounds, right? They have similar needs, similar desires. A lot of them care a lot about the quality here too. A lot of them are academic medical centers that they use the coded information from the rev cycle to feed their research, their clinical, their pop health. So being able to work with them to get the quality better and improve that and add ROI on the rev cycle, like it's a similar story to tell, and that helps a lot. But some of it is we've worked hard to get this platform to where it is, and we spent a lot of time trying to work out the kinks and make it easy to implement, and that's where the story starts to sell itself. So once you can get it moving, it makes it easier, because Mass General's using it. So, when we talk to, Mayo's a customer of ours, right? So that was able to help. Sure, they compete a lot of times and they're up there, in the top of the list going against each other. But at the end of the day, they're very similar organizations that have similar needs. So if you're able to meet one of their needs, there's a good chance you'll be able to meet another one of theirs.
You code for risk adjustment, quality measures, population health stuff.
Absolutely.
How does your platform, I guess, evolve as multiple payer contracts move towards that direction? Hospitals and health systems potentially are moving towards that direction as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the problems we had early on when we started, getting into when our system makes mistakes, why is it making mistakes? There's a lot of information in those notes that aren't relevant to the kind of the core fee for service rev cycle problem, but they do help with quality programs. They do help with risk adjust coding, right? There's a lot of other information. So part of that whole rubric we came up with was to try and say, what information is here and what purpose does this play? And at the moment, we may not need that because we're just solving this rev cycle problem. But once we've now classified and we know what information's there, we can now make that available. So it's kind of a byproduct of trying to clean our own quality game up. We're kind of setting ourselves up to be able to be that springboard to go into those other areas, because those other codes, while at the moment they're an error when we're doing rev cycle coding, they're not an error for the pop health group, or they're not an error for that clinical team that's trying to justify a research study or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, what is like a non-consensus view that you hold about the future of revenue cycle AI that I guess most people would potentially push back on?
I think it's some of this quality stuff. I think there's this consensus that there's this high quality coding. And again, it's not that the people aren't doing a good job, and it's not that they don't know what they're doing. It's they have a really hard job, and the consistency and the repeatability in a production environment is really hard. So we've spent a lot of time trying to understand why our machine fails. And as part of that, we're starting to understand better the whole complexity that people have to do when they come up with these codes. So it's being able to say the coding quality isn't quite where you think it is. And we can start to show scientifically where we're saying that from. But that starts to get to, if you're telling that to a coding manager, then you're trying to say, well, their people aren't good. And that's not what we're saying. We're not saying you have bad people. They have a really hard job, and they don't have the appropriate systems in place to really put them over the edge to get the quality where you want it to be. But it's not that they're not smart. It's not that they're not well trained. It's not that, they don't do a good job. It's that what we're asking them to do is really hard to do, especially in a production environment where they have production targets. They have to get through so many an hour, right? They don't have all day to sit here and research it and think, boy, what did the doctor really mean when they put this phrase in there, right? Let me go look through the chart to see how many other things they had going. They don't have the time to do that. So they're at an inherent disadvantage. But because of that, there's this false sense of security that their quality is higher than it really is, and that's hard.
Throughout CodaMetrix, you've had so many different positions within CodaMetrix, like CPO, chief engineer.
Yeah.
Like why did you kind of, I guess,
Absolutely.
make those evolving changes? And did that happen as the company was scaling? Like, what was your thought process there? Yeah.
So it was a couple things. So early on, we had a really small team that built the product, right? And so and a lot of us wore many different hats. But as we started to grow the company, we needed to bring in more talent. And where are my skills best served for where the company is at the moment? And early on, I was taking on a product role, right? But I had never been in a traditional product management job. So that wasn't the right role for me. But early on, that was the best place for me to be. But then as we started to scale, we needed people who were professional product managers, right? Who really understood what product management was. And that's where I actually then moved to run all the engineering teams, right? So I ran the engineering teams for a while, but I had never run really big engineering teams before. So I understand the technology and how to work with a small team, but scaling an engineering team is a skill set that I just didn't have. So we had to bring in a real CTO, right? So, and that's where I had to move. And that's where the solutions officer came in. Like, it was, where do I best fit, right? I understand the pieces. I understand enough of the engineering. It's a really technical solution that I'm able to work with the engineering teams, but I can also support the product team. So I'm not a hardcore product person. I'm not a hardcore engineering person. So we kind of created this position to fit me in because we needed it. Because traditional product people tend to miss a lot of the nuance of the super technical solution we have. But a lot of the engineers don't have the context from healthcare to understand how these systems all need to work and what are the bigger patterns in play. So I kind of fit this gap between the two. But that is just, as the company has evolved, we've needed to bring in people and we've had to adjust what we do, right? If I wanted to say, I'm going to take this role forever, like I would have put the company at a disadvantage because I didn't have a lot of that experience. So we needed to bring in other people, but it was just, we're continually trying to figure out, how do we operate this company, right? Like, how do we make this work? And so we've had a lot of changes. And with that, I've bounced around a little bit trying to figure out, how do I complement all of my peers? and how do we work as a team? And it's that trying to come up with the right team is probably the most important thing we've ever had to do here, right? Get the right group of people for where the stage of the company is, because people who are really good early on may not understand how to scale. People who really operate big companies don't know what to do when they're small, right? So it's trying to get that right group, and you need to be flexible, right? Just as the product needed to change as we got it into the market and decided, okay, what is this? We think it needs to do this, but it actually needs to do that, right? Our teams needed to change too. And so it's being cognizant of that and understanding how do we adapt and how do we stay current, and how do we continue to support the organization the best we can. So, and to be honest, it's going to change again. I just don't know what it's going to go to. It's kind of it's fun, right? You just got to be ready for something different tomorrow. That's all. So.
So you're just switching to something new. But quick rapid fire here. Are you ready? So what is the hardest specialty, I guess, to automate coding for?
Definitely in different ways. Surgery's hard because of the complexity. The stuff is really difficult. So evaluation and management, because trying to figure out the level of service that a provider did is really tricky. That's really tricky. And that there's a high risk there too. If you go too high of a level, you run the risk of overcoding, and that turns into a potential situation that no one wants to be in. But if you undercode, you're leaving money on the table.
So what is the biggest oh no moment in CodaMetrix early days?
I think the biggest oh no moment was the legacy platform we had. We knew wasn't going to be able to survive as a commercial entity. We moved away from it too fast. We should have used it more on the early commercial engagements to understand what the commercial software needed to do. So we re-platformed our legacy too soon. And so we had to, it took us a little bit to do that re-platform, but then we still had to learn that exercise. And if we had just stayed on the legacy longer, we could have learned it sooner. So it was that, it's like, when is the time to make that investment? And we didn't make it at quite the right point. I wish we had stayed on the legacy thing a little longer so we could have learned a little bit more.
Absolutely. What do health system CFOs kind of get wrong most about AI vendors?
About AI vendors? Well, I don't, it's hard because I don't consider us like a lot of the other AI vendors. I think what they get wrong, what they probably get right, is their concern that the AI is overselling, right? That, so I think they get that right. So what they can get wrong is which partner to go with, right? It's how do they validate that this partner, is going to grow with them. And so that's where a lot of these failures come at. It's the wrong technology for the wrong site. So trying to do that matchmaking and make sure you've got the right partner is hard. So it's hard to say the CFO is doing it wrong, but it's understanding what your needs are and what this vendor's bringing to the table. And if they don't meet your needs, are they going to be able to adapt and grow with you, right?
Yeah. If you could change one thing in healthcare right now that isn't obviously in revenue cycle and coding, what would that be?
I would try to get rid of the friction. There's way too much complexity and bespoke processes that add a tremendous amount of friction and cost everywhere. So I need to be careful there. I've made a career out of taking advantage of that, but really it adds so much cost, the fact that everybody operates differently, and everything just gets harder because of that. So I wish it was more standardized for how it operated so that we could just remove costs, because it's too expensive. Our healthcare system is the best in the world, but it's just too expensive to operate. So it's being able to bring those costs down so we can get more care into the patient. And it's how do you do that, right? Because that's really what everyone's here for, right? We're trying to help people at the end of the day, but you got to pay for it.
Yep. Final question. Best piece of advice you've ever gotten that you did not listen to?
It was probably around the team. When I first started with Hamid, he made the point, we need to get the right people. And it's not that I didn't listen to him. I didn't appreciate how that was really going to play out over time. And being able to get the right person for the right job at the right time. And so I heard him, but I didn't really appreciate it. And I didn't invest enough as we were going on earlier to make sure we had the right people for where we were at the time. And we lost some time by having some good people, but they weren't the right person for where the company was. And it's trying to, you need to be very cognizant when you bring new talent in, that they're the right person for where you are as a company. Just because they're a great person, if they're someone who's run a 1,000-person company company and you're at 6, they might not be right for you, right? But likewise, if you got someone you need to get to 1,000 people and you've only brought in people who are good at startups, doesn't matter how good they are at the startup side, they're not going to know how to scale the business. So it's trying to get that, and that's really hard to do because there are a lot of people with a lot of experience you want to be able to take advantage of, but it's like, where does that person going to make me a better person? In being very cognizant of how to bring the right team around everybody, because it's no one person can do this. You need the right team. And that those needs change as the company grows and matures. So you're and constantly looking at that. And early on, I didn't appreciate how that was going to play out, and I wasn't paying enough attention to it. And again, it's not that the people we brought in were bad people, and it's not that they didn't have good skills. They didn't have the right skill for the company. And it's kind of like why I moved my job around, right? Like early on, I was the jack of all trades. I was able to do a lot, but as we continued to grow, I had a lot of areas that I wasn't good at, and I needed to help, step aside to let people come in with those skills.
But dude, this was amazing to do, and thank you so much for being on the show. I enjoyed this so much. It was a pure joy.
I had a great time, Vic. It was great talking with you, and I'd love to talk again if you get the chance.